I was super interested in writing songs that were intentionally to be misinterpreted.
This is Champagne is Also a Band podcast. One songwriter, one song. I'm Sven, your host for a journey into the music of Champaign-Urbana. Recorded in the Blue Box studio with a songwriter from the Champaign-Urbana music scene, past or present. Champagne is Also a Band podcast is proud to be a part of the Champagne Showers Podcast Network. Welcome to Champagne is Also a Band podcast. Today, I have Rick Valentin. You may know Rick from such bands as Poster Children, Salaryman, and Thoughts Detecting Machines. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Rick, today you chose He's My Star off of the album Junior Citizen. This song is from the album Junior Citizen from 1995. I have to say I'm very curious about your thoughts on why this was your favorite song you wanted to talk about today. But without further ado, let's listen to the song.
I am on the beach, looking for the thief that stole my heart from under me. Let it drift to sea.
Welcome back, Rick. My first and favorite question to ask is, what came first? Was it the music or was it the lyrics?
Oh, always the music in our bands. With Poster Children, I think maybe I wrote a couple songs very early on in the band, and then Rose and I wrote songs together. Like I'd play on acoustic guitar and I'd have all the lyrics written out, but it was always music first. But then pretty soon after the band started, there was a really early song, I think called Question, which was us just jamming in the attic of the house we were living in. And I just started singing words over the jam, and that became much better than what I was writing. And so that pretty much from then on has been the method with Poster Children since then, which is that we come up with music. Some of it's from improvisation. Sometimes somebody brings in a riff, and then we build it out, and I scat sing over it, and then I fill in the lyrics later. I do keep track of interesting snippets, possible chorus or titles of songs, and sometimes I'll put that into an existing piece of music if I can't think of something. I don't think I ever sat down and wrote lyrics like saying, "Oh, I'm gonna write some words and put them to music." I've never done that. I have written down, Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Oh, that's a good... I'm going to remember that. That might be good to put in a song when I can't think of a chorus, right?
Right.
That's not one of them, but that's an example. I'll have little bits and pieces, snippets, little notes, like maybe a couplet, I guess, or a rhyme scheme about something. But for the most part, it usually starts with me scatting over the song and seeing what comes out. I guess it's the speaking in tongues method. That's like that Talking Heads record. And actually Remain in Light's like that too. I think a lot of those lyrics came out of David Byrne making up stuff, making sounds, and then slowly they turned into words. I usually make sounds until I come up with an idea. If I go blah, 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 I don't listen back and then try to figure out what those words are. It's more about the rhythm, and then I can start plugging in words into the rhythm. In fact, what happened with He's My Star, I remember it vividly, actually, as we were in a loft up in Champaign where we rehearsed and lived. It was kind of behind where the original Blind Pig was, on Main Street, so the other side of the block, and we were working on new songs, and I had that riff. I just had the riff that the song is. There's no changes, really. It's just the same thing looping over and over again, and I had that, and I started singing, and then I sang in a very kind of lighthearted way. I sang, "I am on the beach looking for the thief that stole my heart away from me," and I was kind of singing in a smarmy kind of romantic way, and my brother laughed, the guitarist, and I was like, oh, I made Jim laugh. I better work on this. And that's kind of the origins of it. But then it spun out into something much more complex lyrically.
I'm picturing, because of the way that the song rolls out the parts, you have that original riff. Did you actually do this on the acoustic first?
I'm trying to think if I had an acoustic then. I didn't have an acoustic guitar for many years, and I feel like it's entirely possible. Maybe I had just bought an acoustic. So it's a little strange. I had been in a band, and we had made records for quite a few years before that. Yeah, I think I must have... Yeah, that must be... Actually, yeah, that's probably what happened is I bought an acoustic guitar. And so that's probably where that riff came from, is that I actually had my first nice acoustic guitar. I mean, I learned on an acoustic, but it kind of exploded, and then I got an electric guitar. I didn't play the acoustic forever. I had a weird electric 12-string that could work as an acoustic. But yeah, so it's possible I wrote it on the weird electric 12-string, but regardless, it seems like an acoustic-y kind of song initially.
I'm curious. It sounded like the way that songs get formed within the Poster Children is that there's an idea musically that's presented, and then everyone kind of fills in their parts. The thing that I like, and so I'm correct in that, is that you nodded. That's why I was okay.
Yes. Yes.
I didn't want to go down this rabbit hole and not. But the thing that I like about this song is there's that intro of the acoustic theme, and then the interlacing of the different parts that overlap it and then change. I mean, some of the things that are happening in the bass are almost parallel octaves happening, but then later in another verse, that part comes in and it's actually changing the harmonics, the chords that are actually being represented there because the bass is going. And I always love that type of interaction because it's one of the things that makes music so interesting. Is like, if I were to speak and say the same thing over and over and over and over without any change, it would be boring. But like musically, when there's a theme that goes through it and then the things that change around it make the effect or make the emotional context change, I think is really fascinating. I think in some ways it runs as kind of this metaphor for what you're trying to say. So if we're going to jump into the lyrics, you said that the first line for you was the "I am on the beach looking for the thief that stole my heart from under me." When did the idea of this person who is "he's my star," when did that theme come into being, and then when did that evolve into this story that pieced everything together? I'm
actually not sure. I think probably it started, once I had the beach thing, then I was like, where am I going to go with this? And so I actually listened to the Angie episode last night, Angie Heaton episode, and she said, what was it her brother told her? Don't tell people what it really means. What it really is about. Our A&R guy at the record label really loved this song, and then I told him what it was about, and he completely 180'd on the song, is what I remember. And then I tried to explain it in more detail to make him realize. So the idea of the song, it goes from sounding like, if I explain it, I'm trying to figure out a way to explain it well. It's people get a pretty emotional response to the song, I feel like. And then if I tell them what it's about, they're disappointed. But then I try to go a little further and explain how it does have resonance, even though it's about this person. So maybe I'll preload with that explanation.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, well, I
was going to say, maybe,
bail me out.
maybe it would be fair for me to give my interpretation, because and I know that this, well, hopefully this is completely different from what your intention was, because I am absolutely fascinated by the idea of having your intent and my impression coexist in my brain while I'm listening to it, which it's like somehow our minds are able to do that, right? Like you can interpret both at the same time and consume it that way. My original thought is this person that is he's my star. I thought about, the way that we use the word star, like sometimes we see the star as something that guides us out in the sea, which you make a lot of water references, etc., things that guide us, like the star. And then also, star is something that we, when we say someone's a movie star, we put all sorts of grandeur on them. And so the way that I kind of interpreted this, the weird thing is that I think that the timeline, well, okay, so the first verse happens latest in the timeline, which is interesting, which I was thinking about, because the point at which you are right now, but everything else is looking backwards. So, because I think about you're on the beach looking for the thief that stole your heart from under you, and I imagine that you're out and maybe you get caught up by these waves, and this person that you looked up to in high school and you knew, I interpret as someone who graduated and then you never saw them again, but then you go, I mean, I'm almost taking this a little too literally, of this idea of you get swept out to sea and somehow you just happen to be in the same place as this person and they save your life, which, I said that's a little, I almost take it a little too literal, but the fact that in the verse 3, the final line of, without a clue that soon our paths would cross, is that after this person had left high school, you never thought you would see them again, but when you needed somebody, they were there and they saved your life, I guess. I'm saved when a familiar face comes crashing through the waves. And so I imagine that that's this person. You had the film trick about this where it's like you're starting to tell the story at the end of the story. That was my broad strokes of my interpretation, but I'm kind of curious if you wanted to expand on that.
A lot of what you said, it touches on all the things that I wanted or I was working on in that song, like I was trying to hit. So, and yeah, I didn't even realize the kind of flashback or flash. Yeah. There's kind of a flashback in the song, and it's also making me realize, I mean, I do try to do sometimes with songs, do some kind of overarching narrative, right? So that the narrative moves along. And then I feel like sometimes what I do is a little simplistic, and then, but you explaining that where it's like, oh, it has a flashback. It's a little more advanced narrative going on there. So that actually makes me feel good. I mean, maybe when I was writing it, I knew what I was doing, but I think I've sung it so much and I'm on autopilot when I sing it. I haven't actually spent a lot of time in the past. How long has it been now? 25 years?
I believe 28 is the magic number.
I haven't thought as much about it. So this is interesting. And the stuff about stars and famous people, that's an important part of it. So, well, I should stop being coy and I should say what it's about. So my brother and I went to a high school in the Chicago suburbs called Lyons Township High School. David Hasselhoff went to that high school years before, not the same time, 10 or 15 years before us. And so the long story is, so first off, singing something about swimming and everything like that, that's David Hasselhoff. I think probably making my brother laugh, and it was just thinking about my brother and myself, and then the fact that we had this history. And then also Mark Robinson from this band Unrest. He used to write these songs about these kind of super cool hipster people like Kath Carroll. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, but some of his songs were always like these really like little kind of micro stories about this famous person, musician maybe, or not famous, but like cult musician, and then how they influence them. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it with somebody who's not cool, right? And then I'm not going to tell people what I'm writing about. I'm going to use this person as a structure, right, as a method of doing that. And so I was also, at the time, super interested in misdirection. So kind of similar in the way of like, I'm not saying I'm going for this level of songwriting, but like Born in the USA or Every Breath You Take, like those songs got misinterpreted, right? They're super sort of, well, Born in the USA, right, is a protest song, right? But everyone thinks of it as a patriotic song, and Every Breath That You Take is a stalker song, and everyone thinks it's a beautiful love song, right? I was super interested in writing songs that were intentionally to be misinterpreted. There's a Poster Children song called New Boyfriend, where it's a guy kind of talking about how jealous he is of his ex's new boyfriend, and it's like all this stuff, but as you listen to it, you realize, oh, this is a really awful person, right? But somebody might just say, oh, I love this song. It's about, when you break up with someone and how much you hate their new boyfriend. And well, no, actually what I'm doing is I'm showing you that, if you identify with this, you're an awful person kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or it like slowly gets revealed as like, oh, this person's bad. I was interested in misdirection also. So not intentionally tricking people, but making people think that the song was about one thing, but doing it intentionally as opposed to those unintentional examples, right?
Right.
And so there's a mix of that in there. And it was also with the understanding that if I make it vague enough, but if I put in some clues, maybe somebody will figure it out. But if somebody doesn't, it'll still be resonant. And so that's why I'm always a little wary of talking about it. But to wit, if that's the right way of using that phrase. So the thing is that it's very much, to me, though, is that I was not happy in high school. I was not popular. I watched a huge amount of TV. I was really invested in people on the TV. And what you were saying about stars is that you can have these intense personal relationships with these people who don't know who you are, these stars. You can have a resonant relationship with them, right? And I mean, it's obvious now. I think maybe it was less obvious then, or it wasn't. It's always been obvious, right? It's about how personal at least one side of that relationship can be. And then really it's just about how, watching TV and seeing, it sounds stupid when I say it, watching Knight Rider, in high school, and it's like, oh, this is really cool. And I feel like, and then that person you had this relationship with, oh, this is a person that went to the same high school as I did too. And it's like, oh, it's this famous person and I have, they have a similar experience to me and there's all these deeper connections. And then that person disappears for a while and then they came back. And then there are a huge number of, not a huge number, but a good number of poster children songs that are about me being upset with myself for watching too much TV. And kind of like how that was in some ways the way I dealt with what I guess would now be called depression. But at the time, it was just, I don't know. It's what I did. I watched a lot of TV.
Yeah. Well, oh gosh. And it's so funny to even think about when I'm thinking about this, I'm like, no, that's not right. I'm like completely remembering it wrong. But I'm like, as a kid, as a younger human, I loved Knight Rider. I thought it was great, and he was perfect in that, and I can't imagine my childhood without it, right? But then now I'm thinking about how from there he disappears, and then he comes back in Baywatch, right? Like, right. And so, okay, so I didn't misunderstand that, but that even makes this more funny to me, this idea that, this person that comes to save you is David Hasselhoff from, Baywatch.
Baywatch.
So yeah. that's great.
And I think it comes off as a joke. I think when I say that, like when I said that guy who was at our label and was really, really, was like, is this a true story? Did you almost drown once and everything like that? I'm like, no. And then I finally told him, and he was just, he was a baby boomer. He was really invested. There was no postmodernism or irony in his way of interpreting that. It was like, he felt like it was just a big joke. And then I tried to explain to him, no, it's not a big joke though. I'm the reason why it's emotional and there's an emotional connection is because I'm talking about the power of these people to help us through. They can act as friends, right? And plenty of people write songs about when that goes over too far, right? So it's like fans, that's almost like a trope, right? Is like the fan who goes too far kind of song, right?
Right.
And this is about, the positive side where it's like, these people can bring you joy or bring you back, or even the nostalgia, of like, I haven't seen Gabe Kaplan in 40 years, and then all of a sudden he shows up in this TV show. It's an old friend. It's kind of like seeing an old friend. And those ideas, it's a lot more complex than just simply, Rick's basically tricking everyone into thinking it's a really serious song, but it's not. And that was not my intent.
Right. I feel like this is a whole rabbit hole we could go into, but honestly, when there's a show and there's an actor that you could look back on and say, I identify that with my younger self. I recognize that as something that I knew it would be on every, Friday night. I could tune in at 7:00. There'd be Knight Rider, and this would be something that represents something as a base of who I grew into be.
Yeah.
And then I think about that same actor being in something that is, I would not say that was a formative, I wouldn't say Baywatch is a formative show.
Right, yeah.
I almost want to say in a lesser extent, it's that something that you grew up with, and there's a lot of examples, and I don't want to actually name the actor, and maybe my hints will be enough, where somebody that you grew up with, that you looked up to, that you thought was a great representation of who would be a good father, the all-American family, turns out to be an absolute horrific human being. And I don't want to say, so I'm just only hinting. I mean, there's enough examples in other places that it may not even be just that person. But at least with your story, it doesn't go to that extent. But there is that sense of like loss of childhood when a person you looked up to became something that you would not, or was always this. But yeah, it's interesting to me that this is now coming up in my head. It's like, it's not just about the story, it's about that particular person and the changes from like what happened from them in high school to becoming an actor, then becoming an actor in another show.
And what you're saying is making me realize that really scary part of fame. So, everybody talks about it. I think probably when they talk about songs, it's like, at least I talk about it as like, once I'm done with it, and then other people interpret it and they add all of their thoughts and perspectives into it. So that's the thing, is a lot of times when people do talk about songs that I've written to me, their interpretations are always better. I feel like are more complex, right? And
Sure.
it's like, and you realize, when you create something, it is, that's, again, a trope. I put it out there in the world and then it's no longer mine, right? That's always the idea of authorship and the artist, right? And it's like, once you put it out there, you lose authorship and it's shared authorship then, or it might even be like you can't even claim authorship anymore. People are going to interpret it. And then realizing, wow, if you're an actor and your physical self is that, wow, can you imagine? And then also, just hearing stuff like, when Bob Dylan said, I didn't want to be the voice of a generation. It's like, yeah, he was like, and kind of like, veered off where it was just like, I don't want to embody that. And it's like, he created all this work, but then all of a sudden people started investing all of these grander ideas into him and responsibilities into him, and he was like, I don't want to do that. And so that to me is where you realize, wow, that's kind of the dark side of fame, is how do you deal with the fact that it's not even that, I wrote a song and then a bunch of white supremacists are using it or something, right? That would be bad, right? But if it's like, I created this character and I played this character, I didn't even create it, and now a bunch of white supremacists like it, and it's like, but every time someone sees me now, they think I'm a white supremacist. It would be like, that would totally mess with that. I'm using an extreme example, but it's like that would totally mess with you mentally, and that's why fame is terrible and a difficult thing to deal with, I guess.
And isn't that also the trick too, is like, what I create is not necessarily me. It's like, that is not how I identify. It may be a way that you express who you are, but it doesn't make it you. I think sometimes people lose sight of that. The other flip side to that coin is the things you do outside of being the creative person, being the person that people look up to, does affect who you are and what people can look up to or not look up to. That would be very scary to me personally. As an introvert, I would not want anyone to know anything more about me than I want them to know.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat.
Yeah.
On the sea.
When you say without a clue that soon our paths would cross, with your interpretation, have you ever met David Hasselhoff?
While we were on tour once, he was doing a mall tour. I think it actually was when we were playing Lollapalooza, actually. And then we found out he was doing a show in a mall. Kind of one of those things where he sings one song and people sign photos and everything like that. And so we went to the mall and we thought, and I think it was right around, it would have been a little after this record came out, and Poster Children. This was a Poster Children thing. And we all go to the mall and we're thinking, we're going to give him a copy of the record, tell him it's about him. We're going to say, two of the members of the band went to his high school, the same high school and everything like that. We'll have like this entree point. And then like we get there and there's a crowd, obviously, And then he's taking questions from the crowd, and a woman gets up and says, I went to high school with you. You know, someone was in the audience who actually went to Lyons Township High School at the same time as him, like was in classes with him and everything. And then we're like, oh, okay, it's not that. Like, here's somebody who actually knew him in high school. Oh, but it was interesting. Also, he was ranting about radio and how he couldn't get a song on the radio, and we were kind of in the same situation. We weren't ranting about it, but it was that era when bands like us could possibly at least be on, you know, the commercial alternative radio stations. It was a weird moment because it was like, oh, David Hasselhoff has the same problem we do. No, never met him face to face. Although I think Rose may have given him the CD at that event. So yeah, never met him sort of in any direct way.
Actually, that yielded I think a great great story. Thank you for sharing that.
You know what? I'm looking at this and I want to just talk about the line where I give away the whole thing. I think.
Yeah.
That I'm actually looking back at the lyrics externally as if I didn't write them. And I thought, oh, that's kind of good. And so there's a couple of lines in the song. Before he learned to swim, a voice would come to him on night rides, right? So a voice would come to him on night rides. Faceless William, which is William Daniels, who did the voice of Knight Rider, elsewhere known as Mark. So his character was Dr. Mark something in St. Elsewhere. So elsewhere known as Mark. And the father of Benjamin, he was actually Dustin Hoffman's father in The Graduate. And so that's all pre-IMDb. So that was just, that's like my movie obsession encapsulated in one thing where I was like, oh, this is a spoiler. Like anyone reading those lyrics is going to know that I'm talking about David Hasselhoff. And I feel like now that I look at it, I go, oh, wow, it's pretty cryptic.
Well, okay. So, do you remember what the acronym for KIT stood for?
Oh, I wish I did. Knight Industries something.
It's a number, which is so funny.
Knight Industries. No, I can't.
2000.
Can't pull it out of my brain.
2000, right?
Really? That's what TT
you used the last two T's to say 2000. So it's
2000. Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
See, now you've spoiled everything for me.
Oh, sorry.
It's like, that's a spoiler.
Well, I always
I mean, it's just like, wow, they couldn't think of anything better, like tactical something.
Right.
Like
tactical transport. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. That took what? How long did that take you to come up with? That was yeah, they could have done that in the writing room.
Right. But if you remember, it always seemed like if they wanted something to be futuristic, they always made it 2000. Yeah. So that's like,
yeah,
you know, in the year 2000. Oh man, you're giving me all sorts of like flashbacks. I'm like, remember when they decided to go ahead and give David Hasselhoff a goatee and he was like his evil brother?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
and twin episode.
And car.
Yes.
You know, you always had to have the evil. Like, why didn't they put a goatee on that car? Right?
Car, exactly.
Oh man, just the memories. And even when you say, I saw him every week, you know, on TV, you know, driving down the street, a savior in a brand new car, shining like a star. Wow, verse 2, like, just laid it all out. That's crazy. It's
right there.
I never made that correlation. That's amazing.
And I think it's a good thing you didn't. I think the song is much better without all of these reveals, actually. I think it's, in a way, I realized, I was using this as a sort of structure or a foundation to build this much more, you know, sort of interesting lyrical and emotional piece, right? And realizing that I do like systems, and I like system art. I like art that's built from systems or has structure, and that's why I like songwriting is better than just writing, which is painful to me, is that there are boxes and units and a structure that I can plug stuff into. And so for me, realizing now too is that, that was just an initial sort of conceit that I used to build the song, because I had to write a lot of songs, write a lot of lyrics. That's the downside of this method. The way we approached songwriting in the band is that we'd write a ton of music at that time because we were just doing the band full time. We were lucky to do the band full time. So we'd have these kind of marathon sessions where we'd just kind of pound out these songs and arrange them. But then I'd have to write words. And so it was like, how am I going to write another song? I need something to build a new song on, because lyrics were always the hardest part for me.
Huh. It manages to be cryptic and meaningful. I love your original interpretation in the mix. I mentioned this earlier. As much as I love the lyrics and I am pleased with how the energy just pulls into the chorus, but yet you still have that riff that you're talking about playing throughout that part, but you're using the instrumentation around it to keep it moving forward. That really is a demonstration of what I think is my favorite part of this, is that it has that theme running throughout, and yet the way that the music goes is it's like it explores all the opportunities that you could take with that musically. So it's like there's the drums come in and all of a sudden there's this new energy and impulsion in there. Some of the bass lines that Rose is doing change the way that you interpret the chords that are being, or the sonic sound overall, rather than just doubling. She's also adding in other parts a different version of chords and inversions of those chords. So it just, to me, I find the simplicity, but then an additional complexity because of the exploration being my favorite part in this piece. So in turn, I'd like to see what's your favorite part of this song?
Well, yeah. I think you kind of hit upon that, is because a lot of Poster Children songs are built out of riffs. Yeah, I think that's what I like about it in general, is just that it works with just the single riff going through it, but then we modify it or alter. I play the same thing pretty much through the whole song, and I just hit my distortion pedal, like when we play it live. I'm realizing now on the recording, it does have the acoustic guitars, but really, so I think the original way we wrote it and the way it was in the band is like electric guitar clean, and then electric guitar with a pedal. I never move my hand, really. I just move my fingers. That minimalism, but then the song is complicated out of that minimalism, and it's something that we explored a lot, and it's kind of a rut, I would say, in some ways I'm in, where I do like very loopy, kind of repetitive music that has parts come in and out. And so this was, an example of where that was successful. And people liked it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because I know we had other songs around that time that just had the same riff over and over again, but at some point we would have to put in another chord. I know there's a video somewhere of this song from our second record called Water, and initially that song only had one. It was basically in D and was just the riff over and over again. And then I remember Bob the drummer said, it needs another chord. And it's like, what about this chord? And then we put it in, and it was even better. The song was even better. Oh, okay. Yeah, we should put in a second chord. And that happened a number of times where it was like, okay, we got to put in another chord, another part, right? We can't just do the same part over and over again. Whereas, He's My Star, we got away with it without having to put in another part. And that, to me, is what I like about it. The reason why I picked it in general was because I think my voice sounds good on it. I've never liked my voice, and I always struggle with how I sound on record and recording. And I go back to that song often and try to figure out, even in terms of like microphones, I wish I could remember what microphone and what outboard gear it was run through. And it's just like, it's almost like my ideal voice in my mind, even though I listened back a while ago and I could on really good speakers, and I could hear, okay, I'm starting to hear where it's sketchy, right? So I'm even unraveling that. I can't even, listen to that song and go, oh, this is a goal to try to recapture this moment. And so that's the other thing about it, is it's one of the few songs that I think when I listen to it, I go, oh, okay. Instead of saying, oh, I wish we had done that, or, ooh, this doesn't sound, oh, there's that voice again. It's like I can actually listen to it without getting neurotic or psychotic, because I don't listen back to the music unless I have to relearn the songs. This is one of the few that I at least use as a reference to kind of calibrate, a bunch of different things.
Honestly, maybe this isn't my podium to stand, but, I think that a lot of musicians that are starting up that are scared to record because they don't like the sound of their voice, but they want to make music, they want to create things. Hearing you have doubts about your own voice when you keep making music and people continue to love it, I think that a lot of people should take that to heart. just get it out there, just make it happen. Sometimes people get afraid that people won't like their voice, or I hope you know what I'm trying to say, but it's just like I want more people to be like, I know this demo isn't 100%, but I feel like people need to hear this, because I don't know, sometimes it's neat to see people go from the initial stages of something being created to its final iteration. I don't know, I find that really inspiring. But anyway, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I've been actively trying, like, I teach college students. I say this about the creative process, too. It's just like, it's not about joy. And especially for me, and it's like, but also talking to other people, it's like, it's hard. It's more like a relationship is what I've been saying lately, is that, yeah, there are good things about it, but then you have arguments with your creative, that it's kind of like an extra person you're married to, or that's in your family, or that you have a constant relationship as your creative muse, or whatever you want to call it. And it's like not 100% joyful relationship. It's a complicated relationship. And so the doubt and the frustration, but even from like, I talk about this about technical stuff too. It's like, I've got 40 years of experience with computers and programming, but I still, at least once a week, I run into a situation where I think, oh, I've done it. I've worked myself into a corner, and I've created a problem that I can't fix and that my knowledge is incapable of. It's like those problems have become more complex, and I have more experience dealing with them. But the fear, the frustration, the sense of failure, all of that I still have that. And yeah, it's the same with the creative process. It's just like, ugh. And then it always goes back to me like, well, why are you doing this? And and there's always that question too that comes up pretty regularly. But I also know that, well, I'm not happy when I don't do it either, or I just wind up doing it anyways, and I go back to writing songs, and and it just happens, and it's something I do, and it's probably the way it's a coping mechanism, and it's the way I communicate or try to communicate with the world. I do have bouts of introspection. In fact, the new one is like, I think maybe somebody told me that something I did, like I played a song, or I wrote a poem or something, and I got positive feedback in an environment where I never got that. And then it's like, oh, I'm going to do this because somebody said they liked it. It's like, it's entirely possible. It's just like one person said that to me, and it just kind of stuck, and I just continued doing it. And that was the thing, my complicated relationship with creativity. It's the dark one that it just threw at me this time, where it's like, it's entirely possible that the reason why you do this is not because it's something that you're good at or that you're born to do. It's because at some point someone gave you a pat on the head and you just ran with that. You grabbed that little moment of positive reinforcement and have, spent your whole life, your whole creative life on that. That really freaked me out when I went there. But there's this book called The War of Art, about how everything is conspiring against you to, get your creative work done. Like even people who love you, right? It's just like, they don't want to see you suffering. They don't want to see, and they say, why don't you just quit doing that? And it's like, everything is a battle kind of a way. And I'm realizing I do that to myself too. And I think that's in the book. It's been a long time since I read the book, but it's just like, it's never a 100% positive experience. A relationship. I'm calling it a relationship now. Yeah. Music. Yeah.
Champaign is also a band podcast is proud to support Jubilee Cafe. Jubilee Cafe is a free weekly meal program at Community United Church of Christ, 805 South 6th Street in Champaign, Illinois. Jubilee Cafe serves a home-cooked meal from 5 to 6:30 each Monday. Their mission is to feed hungry people by cooking healthy, delicious meals and by serving their guests restaurant-style with servers waiting on tables. Jubilee Cafe is open to anyone who cares to eat with them. Because food insecurity among students is so high, they serve students as well as others in and around the Champaign-Urbana community who struggle with hunger. Meals are free to all and will be served each Monday evening, located in the accessible lower level of the building at 6th and Daniel Streets in Champaign. For more information on the meal or how to volunteer, go to the Jubilee Cafe CUCC Facebook page or email them at jubilee.cafe@community-ucc.org. jubilee-ucc.org. That's jubilee.cafe@community-ucc.org.
Welcome back. So, Rick, do you have any favorite Champaign-Urbana venues, past or present?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and it's a strange one. Oh, now I'm trying to decide between two. So these were two mid-'80s places. So there was Tritos Uptown, which was kind of up above. What was the White Hen? Is that building even there? Now all that's been torn down even. There was a White Hen pantry, and then there was a sandwich shop called Tritos Uptown, but it had a stage. And Chris Corpora, who was a musician in town, was booking bands there. So I saw like Dinosaur Jr. there. I saw Nirvana there playing with Steel Pole Bathtub, before, Nirvana blew up. There was just so many great bands. I know people talk about Mabel's a lot, but when we were starting out, Poster Children, we couldn't get shows at Mabel's. Mabel's was great, but it was pretty metal focused at the time. So when indie rock, sort of alternative was happening. And then, so maybe like a band that was more kind of REM-y would be able to play at Mabel's. I feel like really early on, we didn't get into Mabel's unless it was like a weeknight. Or there was an out-of-town indie band that was touring, and they got a weekday show. So bands that were coming from St. Louis and going to Chicago, would stop in Champaign, these cool indie bands, and then they might get a show at Mabel's. So Tritos Uptown was like the place where we could play regularly because Chris booked it and was putting together shows, and that was where we met a whole bunch of out-of-town bands. You'd open for an out-of-town band, or they'd open for you, and then you'd trade shows with them. So I think it was Tritos Uptown. It was an interesting place. It was definitely like all wooden and very echoey. I remember watching Dinosaur Jr. play from the hallway. There was a stairwell up into the space, and I had to stand out in the stairwell and watch them because it was so loud. But it was amazing. The other one was Chin's, so House of Chin, which was the third floor of the House of Chin, and then that was a little tiny room. There's like a Digits song called Under the Christmas Fish, which is talking about this, kind of weird bar, and then they let weird bands play to, 10 or 15. It was room for maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 people. Like that was the place I saw the Flaming Lips the first time. It was like, I'm trying to think of what year that would have been. Tugrik de Gugrik, which was a band that like Andy, who was later in Hum, was in. They opened, and so little tiny, like it was almost like playing in a living room. Those places are the ones I have fond memories of because we actually played a lot of shows there. But I saw a lot of great shows at Maples, but it didn't feel like our home base until later.
It's amazing, especially, currently you're not living in Champaign-Urbana, but at the time you were living in Champaign-Urbana, and it's interesting to me how what used to be like the central venue location was Campus Town, and
Right.
now it's more, we still have Campus Town to a certain extent of the Canopy Club, but it's not like you go into Campus Town and there's this venue here, this venue there. And it sounds like, Tritos and Mabel's, those were less than a block away from each other. And like they were almost on top of each other.
They were on the same block. Yeah,
right?
yeah. They were on the same block.
Yeah. So I think that currently people have a hard time envisioning what that kind of looked like. Oh, and I'm not even thinking, I didn't even mention like Nature's Table, that's also
Right.
all part of that circle of, and I know I'm forgetting some, so anyone...
Trinos, which was the place, near in the same area that the Canopy Club is now, which used to be the Thunderbird Theater, movie theater. Yeah, Trinos is like Espresso Royale was in the part of the Trinos space. Yeah, so it was all centered around campus. In fact, I remember that loft that we wrote He's My Star and lived in downtown Champaign. Downtown Champaign was like a ghost town at that time. It was like when there was no one in downtown Champaign. And I remember we were already living in that loft. I think maybe like I want to call them the ACAC crowd, but that would have been like Moon 7 Times maybe crowd were living sort of above where Skins and Tins used to be. I think they were in that building. And so there were a couple of bands in lofts and there was nothing. And then I remember when we were living in that loft, when the Blind Pig was the first Blind Pig, it was like they were renovating that space. I remember we went in there to see the new space and it was like, who's going to come to this ghost town to see music? Right. And it was like, oh, wow, it actually did all move because it was all centered in campus. So yeah, Mabel's and Tritos were right in the middle of campus town. And then, yeah, Trino's and Nature's Table were in the sort of Urbana edge of campus. And that was, all the music. There were no venues. There were house parties and stuff, but nobody went outside of that kind of campus area for shows. There was a loft. Somebody else had a loft, like Chris and Ward. Who else lived in that loft? I think Rick Digit lived in that loft. It was wherever the old News Gazette, the new News Gazette building that was, what was that called? Rock City. They had shows, but it was like a weird loft kind of thing. And you like college students wouldn't go there. That was kind of after everyone had graduated and we were all starting to populate the weird bombed out downtown Champaign area. Whereas now, I don't think people can even imagine it. I remember sitting in my loft watching them tear down the old abandoned, it was kind of like a big supermarket. No, that main intersection in downtown Champaign now with all the like the hotels and everything like that. There was just this big abandoned supermarket kind of building that I know used to have shows years before I was there, like in the early 80s. It was a complete empty area. And yeah, the change that happened over the course of 30 years was pretty amazing. I'm trying to think of when the Blind Pig, the first sort of version of the Blind Pig, which was kind of just a small just one storefront, and then they expanded later. That would have been in the early 90s.
What makes a good music scene?
I mean, I've thought about that a lot, and definitely it felt like over the years when I lived in Champaign. I mean, I lived there for, how long did I live there? I got to Champaign in 84, and I left in 2010, 25, 26 years. Is that right? Do I have
20?
the math?
Yeah,
20.
20.
Or am I?
Yes.
Am I taking out a decade?
Yeah.
Okay, it wasn't 30. Okay, yeah.
26.
I'm usually good at math, but not when it involves me realizing the passage of time.
Right.
I tend to drop off a decade or two when I do that math in my head. And it definitely went in cycles. I mean, there were high points and low points. And so there was like a panel a few years ago at the Sousa Center, right, the Sousa Archives, where they talked about the history of the Champaign scene from like 1970 to the present, and realizing, wow, there was, there's the 60s, kind of early 70s era, with REO Speedwagon and Dan Fogelberg, and then there's and what's his name, Irving Azoff, right? Was part of that scene, Yeah, in fact, our first Poster Children tour, we met someone who had lived in Champaign in Missoula, Montana, and she was telling us stories about Irving Azoff and all those bands, and it was like, the more you learn about the history, and then, just right before I showed up, there was that era with the Elvis Brothers, and so you realize, there's something about the town that had this, scene and scenes that would pop up, and kind of, there's something about the town in addition to the fact that, it wasn't just this group of people during this few years that made this scene. It was like, there's something else besides the people. The people are important, but there's something else that makes makes Champaign supportive of musicians. And so the way I decoded it was, at least when I was there, it was cheap to live there. There were a lot of young people there, right, who liked to listen to music. And there was a support for the arts, right? The idea. I can't imagine our band surviving if we had lived in Chicago. And we had members of the band who were in Chicago, and sometimes we would rehearse in Chicago, and watching how difficult it was for them to sort of just cover their bills, find a place to rehearse.
Right.
And it's like we were living in a loft for $400 a month or something. And we set up a studio and rehearsal space, and because again, there was no one around at the time in downtown Champaign, it was just a great environment. And then later we were able to buy a house, and pay a mortgage. Other people we knew in the music scene, they were working record stores and working restaurant jobs and they were able to play in bands. So I think part of it was economic and then just having that community and having that support. I think I go to the economics of it, but then it was also people stuck around. People stayed.
Mm-hmm.
I went there for college, but I didn't leave.
Yeah.
And that was the main difference. Talking to people here in Bloomington, there's a little bit of that, and there's some great places, and there are great record stores in Bloomington. One of the struggles is getting people to stay in Bloomington Normal, young people who graduate college, and then they just instantly move to Chicago. And that happened a lot in Champaign, too. But I also remember people, musicians, and they'd leave for a while. Like somebody who had lived in Champaign their whole life, right? And they're in bands, and then, I'm going to move to New York or Olympia or, Chicago. And then like 2 years later, hey, you're back.
Yep.
They'd come back a lot of times too. So there's definitely something magical in that respect. But if I could bottle it and identify it, then I'd be able to, be an urban planner, developer kind of person and be able to go from town to town and help them build a vibrant arts scene.
What is the secret sauce and what is it that Champaign is doing well? But even more so, what do you think? And maybe you could reflect back in the day as what could Champaign-Urbana have done better to make a more supportive music scene?
I don't know. I think at some point there's just a scale. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of moving up to a higher level, right? That's a more kind of like commercial rock thing. And I wasn't super interested in that. So if you think about bands that were in Chicago and Chicago based, there's a sort of next level and next tier. I think Champaign did fine for how big it was. And at some point you can't escape being a central Illinois town that's not a huge urban center. I mean, and there was talk, of like, Champaign's the next Seattle or like Asheville or, North Carolina, the whole, sort of merge scene or the scene in North Carolina, Chapel Hill, right? That scene, they talked about that too. I think maybe it's just scale. Like you can't become the next Seattle if you're not Seattle sized.
Right. Yep.
If you, in terms of that kind of thing. So I don't think Champaign did anything wrong. I don't think it did anything wrong. I'm more philosophical just about the idea of rock music or people going to see live shows and live music. Just my kids, I know, appreciate it. And when they've gone to shows, when I'm playing and performing, they'll go. But they go to live shows. I've got a college-age kid now, and he goes to shows occasionally and goes to see artists live. So I guess there's still that going on. But I also realize that the way live music for me, and then, buying records, that was basically my main source of cultural information and communication in my community.
Right.
It was just records and shows, cool indie bands touring and playing in Champaign and me getting to see them for $3,
right?
Getting to see the Pixies and getting to see, Dinosaur. And I'm trying, there's just a huge list of bands I saw. And that was pretty much my whole life. I mean, and then watching TV, obviously, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, right? But it's not like I was playing a huge number of video games. It's not like I was making, it's just, I think there's a huge, I'm kind of coming to terms with the fact that the type of music and type of performance I'm interested in is kind of moving. I feel like my instinct is it's moving like towards the way jazz is and has been. It's this more sort of niche cultural thing as opposed to being this large cultural force. I don't know if that idea of a scene doing something wrong is even the case now. It's just kind of like, how many people actually do want to see live music?
Right.
That's what I question. Also, I'm an old person.
Right.
That's the other thing, is kind of like, you know what? I know how to get a bunch of 50-something old dudes together at a show in Chicago. I can do that because it's my band, but I don't know how to get somebody under the age of 45, to show up at a show and be part of a vibrant music scene. I'm well past that perspective.
How do you get people to care about music as much as you care about the music that you're creating? I feel like there are people that want to do that, but I don't know if there's always, for me, speaking as a white, cis male, there's not always barriers put up for me, that will be put up for other people, certain gatekeeping things where people can't feel safe or feel welcome in spaces. And I think in general, that should also be a consideration of what makes a good scene, is like having those spaces that are accessible and not just, white dudes, which, you swing a cat, you can hit a white dude at a concert, but it's like, I'd love to see more of those spaces be available.
And I'm starting to think back too, is like when I think back about like 1985, 86, 87, just kind of those formative years where it was just like, this is the most amazing scene in the world. The reality is there were probably about 30 of us. I could collectively, who went to shows, and all of us were in bands, almost all of us, right? It wasn't a real huge number of people. It grew, and bands from Champaign got popular and more popular and toured the U.S. But the reality is even, like I said, seeing the Flaming Lips, and it's like there were probably 15 or 20 people there for that show at Chin's. It was not a huge number of people that made that scene what was so vibrant for me, and changed my life. It was like, oh, it's not like it was 300 or 400 people packing Mabel's at the time, although that happened, right? When the Minutemen played Mabel's, I remember seeing that, and that was amazing. And there were a lot of people. That was like, oh, okay. I don't think there were that many people there, but there were more people where it was just like, oh, okay. So there are more people in town who will go see weird music, and realizing that. So, but it was still a very small group of people that changed my life and changed my perception of what I could do, and supported me creatively, I guess. Right? It was a pretty small group of people, and then it grew from there. So, and then it dissipated. Right? Everybody got older and moved away or had families, and then the new scene, kind of small core group of people, popped up. So maybe this goes back to what I always think about, is like that whole year or two when kind of music that I like was considered possibly commercial. It was kind of ruined everything because everybody had false expectations about what could happen, right? A few people could get famous writing that, but it was like everybody else was happy before just playing their weird little indie rock shows and jumping in a van and touring, and then it all got messed up and perspective got lost.
Champaign is also a band. Podcast is proud to support Exile on Main Street. Exile on Main Street, located in the old train station building at 100 North Chestnut Street in downtown Champaign, has been helping to build record collections since 2004. Carrying a wide array of new and used LPs, CDs, and video games. Exile on Main Street has something for just about any music enthusiast and old-school gaming devotee. Exile also hosts regular free live music shows on its stage, so be sure to check out their Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages for the up-to-date details on the next upcoming event. Open 7 days a week, they can be reached by phone at 217-398-MAIN. That's 217-398-6246. Welcome back. So, Rick, what is your favorite non-musical thing or things?
That would probably be movies, film. When I thought about this question, I was like, wow, do I have a favorite thing even? And it's like, oh yeah, it's movies.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of ties into the TV thing, like watching television, but I also would watch huge numbers of movies on, VHS and then DVD. So that's Entertainment, which was the rental place in Champaign. I think someone said once, is like, the only people who rent more movies than you do are those people in Wolfie. That there was a band, and Joe from Wolfie does film curation, I think, in Austin, and has written books on, horror movies. So, but it was like, yeah, definitely obsessive. Now it's a little easier, but at the time it was a little more work.
Right.
I think when I first started out, and that was, yeah, just having that sort of entertainment, feeding me a constant flow of VHS and then DVDs. That was important.
Yeah. So do you have a particular like genre of movies that you like?
No, I like good movies.
Right.
I'm super tired of, I mean, I do like commercial films, but I am exhausted by, I kind of agreed with the Martin Scorsese kind of, which people interpreted it as a condemnation of like Marvel films or those type of blockbuster films as being, amusement park rides or whatever he called them, as opposed to film. And I do kind of agree with that, but I don't think, I understand the joy of seeing a spectacle, but I don't need to see people punching each other at high frame rates and things exploding. What do I call it? Punch, punch, bang, bang. I don't need to see that anymore. I enjoyed it. I don't know when it was, I'm trying to think of when it was elevated. I'm pretty much a curmudgeon now about that. Like my family made me watch the latest Thor movie, whichever one that was, and I'll watch that. It's okay. For the most part, I guess I have a kind of classic 80s film school perspective that I'm trying to expand. So more diversity. I did watch a lot of international, what was called foreign films at the time, European film, but now I'm trying to expand my knowledge to real world cinema as opposed to what was called world cinema, which was basically like French movies. Oh yeah, and you can watch some Swedish films and French films in addition to all these classic American films. So yeah, no, I don't have a specific genre. I don't like horror. I understand horror is an entry point for young filmmakers, but I'm not particularly fond of that genre. I can tell you what I don't like.
Do you have a favorite movie? What's one that's your go-to if you don't know what to watch?
I do have a favorite movie, but it's not a great movie. I wouldn't call it the height of filmmaking, but it's a movie that's been a part of my life and I've enjoyed for my whole life. And I think that's pretty special. It's not just nostalgia either. So there are movies that I watched when I was a kid that I'll watch again and I'll like because it's nostalgic. Whereas this film, it's called What's Up, Doc, which is a movie with Barbara Streisand and Ryan O'Neal from 1973. It's the movie Peter Bogdanovich directed between Last Picture Show and Paper Moon, which are also great movies. And it's a little bit like Bringing Up Baby, which is the comedy from the 1930s with Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant. It kind of references that. It's kind of a romantic comedy, but then also has, car chases in it. It's funny. It's got a whole underlying story about musicology. Brian O'Neill plays a musicologist, so there's all sorts of music jokes in it. It's just a great slapstick kind of comedy that I'm able to watch, and I've been able to watch sort of every 5 or 10 years and enjoy. Typically, though, I like much darker films. It's not it's not typical of what I like. So anytime, like other movies that I'll go back to, that I'll watch After Hours, a Martin Scorsese movie, which I find hilarious. And then, like, I've even had people like this guy who teaches film here at Illinois State University. He was doing a Martin Scorsese kind of retrospective. I'm like, are you going to show After Hours? It's like, I haven't seen After Hours. And I said, well, I think it's funny, but my wife thinks there's something wrong with me in that I think it's funny. I love it, but it's super dark. Typically, I'll go to something dark and depressing for rewatching that I really love. Children of Men is like one I think of in the past 20 years. I'll watch that. I'll watch that anytime. It's like, I don't think other people necessarily would think of that film as something you want to watch more than once or twice. I'm just going to sound like a weird lightweight, but what is it called? What's the Liam Neeson movie where he's the gray? Like, I'll watch that over and over again. Any movie with some kind of people dealing with the reality of death, but not in a massive slaughter way like these large-scale films work, but it's dealing with death in an emotional, direct way. Yeah, I definitely like films like that.
Thinking in myself, like what would be my favorite movie, and I don't know. Mainly, I'm deep narrative, but more sci-fi and metaphorical, and honestly, and now I'm totally blanking on anything. So I'm impressed you were able to able to retrieve a movie in your head right away.
It's because I've thought about it because I've been stumped, and I used to say I don't have a favorite movie. I mean, I like lots of movies, and I like lots of different films, but I've realized now, and I've spent some time thinking about it, where it's like, okay, no, What's Up, Doc is this weird, it's not, it absolutely, like, if you watch that film, it represents nothing about me, I think, in a way. Like, I guess maybe there's some insight into me and why I like it, but it's like, I don't think it represents the likelihood I would say, oh, that was a great movie, I really enjoyed it. Like the Banshees of Inisherin or whatever that just came out. I mean, I enjoyed that film. Super dark, totally about existential kind of dread, right? And dealing with all of that. I really, really love that. That's the kind of stuff I gravitate towards, more dark, complex narratives. For some reason, What's Up, Doc is something that's been universal in my life, where it's just like, wow, I can watch this anytime, and it brings me joy. And it's worked when I was a little kid watching it as like the after school movie. They used to have movies on TV after school, and I watched it once, and I was just like, oh, I love this movie. Going through the VCR era and then DVD era and then the streaming era, it's like I can watch that film and see new things about it, and it still resonates with me. And so that to me is a magical thing, is a film that works for people, like a film for all ages, right? But there are very few films that actually work on that level, because usually what happens is you have nostalgia. I'm watching this and I love it because I'm reliving something and how it resonated. I'm not actually watching it and enjoying it as a movie that's great now. Like Silent Running is my example of that. Actually, when I went to college, it's like Silent Running blew my mind when I was like 10 or 11. It was like, this is the most amazing movie in the world. And then they showed it on campus when I first got to college, and I'm like, oh, I got to go see Silent Running. And I was just like, oh, I shouldn't have watched it again. I should have kept that magical feeling I had about it, because now I'm seeing it through, I'm seeing all the problems with it. Oh, it's not that, and I like ruined it for myself. Although I watched it again recently, and it was like, okay, I'm getting back into it.
Right.
But I think a lot of it was nostalgia for that era of sci-fi.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say, I know that it can be a little problematic, but, like Blade Runner is probably, aesthetic-wise, is probably one of my favorite movies to just observe, and like the way the buildings are put together, the way things are lit, it's just it just captures the mind, and that's one of my favorite movies. But it's all about like the aesthetics and even the idea of, well, definitely an existential thing, like what is life, what is existence, what is someone's right to live.
Yeah, that film was amazing, because and that's probably one of the earliest examples I remember where it was like, when I watched that film, it was like, oh, and it kind of happened with me with music too, where it was like, but Blade Runner was probably that moment where it was like, oh, all I've heard about this movie is that it's a flop. It's not a good Harrison Ford. So this would have been, like the 1982 or 83 perspective, right? And it's like, it's a flop. The first time I saw it would have been probably on campus when I first got to school, before everybody had a VCR. They'd show films on the weekend, and it was like, and watching that film, and it was like, wow, this is an amazing film, but everything I've heard about it is that it's a failure. And then realizing, oh, okay, just because something wasn't popular doesn't mean it wasn't good. And it was like that to me, that film represented that break where it's like, oh, okay, I need to make sure that I do some deeper work here and research. It's like, just because somebody's, something's not commercially successful does not mean it's not good. It's like, you can dig around and find films that are amazing. And time is, proven that Blade Runner is a great film, but when it came out, it was just like, oh, this is a mess. Yeah. It's like, this is a failure. And it's like, you watch and you go, what were people thinking? And it's like, why did no one see how great this was? And it was just the wrong time.
Yeah.
And too much, story around it. Yeah, it's definitely a profound moment where you realize, oh, okay, the mainstream isn't always right.
Right. Well, I'm definitely finding that out more often than not, right?
Yeah. It's obvious now, right? It's like when you first realize that as a kid, you're just like, oh, wait a minute. And a lot of people never realize it. Yeah. And then you veer off into the world of, you're listening to weird music and you're watching weird movies, and you can't talk to anybody at a party. You can't talk to normal people at a normal person party, right? You got to find your weird group of friends.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the way that I find my weird group of friends is I interview them on a podcast, because that seems the most socially acceptable way for me to communicate with people.
Exactly, and that's what I always say is like, it's to me the reason why I started playing in a band is that I could communicate. It was a different way I could communicate with people, because I obviously could not do it in a direct way. Like, unfortunately, it involves me yelling and playing a very loud guitar, right? And so, that's how I'm going to communicate with people. It worked for me. It definitely helped me. It's just kind of like, that's what the creative process is. That's why we do all this stuff, is like, I think of it as a broken communication mechanism. It's like, I can't communicate in this direct way. I've found this other weird bypass that I can use, and I'm just going to keep doing it for the rest of my life.
Rick, thank you so much for being on the show, telling me all about your song, He's My Star, some of the early beginnings of songwriting with Poster Children, your favorite music venues, and your thoughts on what makes a good music community, and your favorite non-musical thing. And I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me over the interwebs, over Zoom, and I really do appreciate it so very much. Thank you.
Thanks. This was great. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for doing this. Just in general, the podcast, not just talking to me, but in general, the podcast in general. It's a good thing you're doing. Thank you for listening to Champaign is Also a Band podcast. This is Rick Valentin reminding you, great music is out there. Go find it where you live. Blah, blah, blah. I don't listen back and then try to figure out what those words are.
That's a wrap.
Champaign is also a band.
You almost have an NPR voice. It's so good.
South Peter on the inside.
David Hasselhoff has the same problem we do. And I would like it if you made me more coherent.